Well, happy first remote snow day. So this is pretty much what I would have done in class. I'm going to turn off that annoying light behind me. Give me a second. All right, that looks a little better. Hopefully less glare off my balding head. Anyway, so this is a little bit about what you did theoretically in preparation for this class, although it seems to me a lot of people didn't do it. So this unit, as we talked about earlier on the remote day Wednesday in the 24 minutes, is about federalism and how power is divided up. And what I was asking you to do for homework is to see some of the actual powers that are given to each government, because Madison can't just draw a circle and say, we're going to cut it in half. So there are different types of powers in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 describes what are known as delegated powers. Delegated. And they use the word delegated on purpose. And this all goes back to John Locke again. To delegate means to give out. And you might be saying, well, who gave Congress power? Well, first three words of the Constitution, we the people. So when it says Congress shall have the power to tax, that's in clause 1 of this, that's a delegated power. And those clauses that are so specific like that, that say they're allowed to tax, they're allowed to declare war, they're allowed to regulate commerce, which are the three most important of the delegated powers. So to tax, the three most important. Regulate interstate commerce and declare war. These are all known as the enumerated powers. They're called enumerated because they're numbered out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, you all know how to count. So it's this long list of powers, Article 1, Section 8, 1, 2, 3, 17. Then you get to this weird clause, Clause 18. And I probably should have made this an ed puzzle. But anyway, lucky for you, I'm not going to do that. In Clause 18, I have the text on the next page because it's really kind of important. And let me make this a little bigger. That wasn't a lot bigger, but here it is, Clause 18. So it says Congress shall have the power to tax, to declare war. Then you get to this one, and it says to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution and the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. So if you were in class, I'd try to make you figure out what that says, because it's not immediately apparent. When I show you the one that says Congress has the power to tax, you all know what's going on. So I can tell you who didn't like this when they first saw it was the anti-federalists, because it begins by saying to make all laws, and they got to be having half a heart attack. All laws, the government can make all laws, but it's modified. And the all laws that they can make are laws that are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And foregoing in this means clauses 1 through 17. So to give you an utterly ridiculous example, if Joe Biden's Defense Department orders up a gigantic shipment of gray paint to paint all the battleships, and somebody sues him and says, you show me where in the Constitution it says Congress has the power to buy gray paint. Well, of course that's not going to be in the Constitution, and nobody would even sue over it. So stupid. But Congress does have the power to raise a navy, and it does seem to me it's necessary and proper to buy paint to paint the ships so they don't rust and sink. Right? That's the idea. It's meant to be like a little clause at the end to make sure we don't have to write every single detail and get into arguments. Now, of course, the disadvantage of putting something like that at the end is not everybody agrees on what's necessary and what's proper. As a matter of fact, those two words rarely mean the same thing. When I say something is necessary, if I give you my credit card and say you can get a cake and forks, plates, napkins for a party and anything that's necessary. Well, that's pretty strict, right? So, I don't know, you might think of something like, oh, let's just get a candle for the cake because it's birthday. And like, all right, that maybe it's necessary. I don't even know if it's necessary, but it is a birthday. On the other hand, if I give you my credit card and say get those things and anything else that's proper for a party, you can come waltzing in with a disco ball. I'm going to have a hard time arguing it. Parties have disco balls. I like a disco ball. Maybe bring a fire truck. I don't know. So you may wonder why they were so vague. And a lot of this was done and they didn't foresee the problems they'd run into. But if anybody ever gives you the line, we just need to do what the founding fathers said, just know half the time that's a bunch of crap. Because George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson, right, three of the founding fathers, while James Madison was in Congress and they could go and ask him what he meant, got into a huge argument over what's necessary and proper. And the very first argument they ever had was over a Bank of the United States of America. So I don't mean Bank of America. That's a private bank that chose the name Bank of America. I mean, can the federal government run a bank? And Hamilton came over to Washington and said, look, we're allowed to coin money. We're allowed to tax. It's completely proper for us to have a bank. And he was like, all right, that makes sense. I can see that. And Jefferson, on the other hand, said, no. It might be proper, but it's not needed. The states have banks. We can use private banks. We don't need to make a bank. You shouldn't be stretching the power of the United States government. This ended up becoming a big fight. Washington sided with Hamilton. And if you've seen the musical Hamilton, by the way, there's a rap battle about this. And they did, in fact, make a Bank of the United States. So I didn't use the word yet, but the other name for this clause is often referred to as the elastic clause, which I'm hoping is pretty obvious now because it lets Congress stretch its power. And depending on how much you stretch it, how broadly or strictly you read that clause, people get into a lot of arguments. So when we get down here to clause 18, we find out the other kind of delegated power. The other kind of delegated power is an implied power. It's not clearly stated. It is suggested by the necessary or clause or elastic clause. And our first example was a bank that the government can run its own bank. All right, then we got to Article 1, Section 10 I asked you to, Section 9 I asked you to do. That was a denied power, and I asked you to do both the states and the nation, what their denied powers were. And denied powers are really powers prohibited, pretty much as the name would suggest. So there are some powers that are prohibited to both governments, like, for example, neither one is allowed to have a title of nobility. You're wondering what that is. You know, in England, they have the Duchess of York and the Duke of Edinburgh. Not allowed to have that here. No state can make a Duke of Harrisburg, nor can the United States make a Duchess of Tampa. Whatever it is, you're not allowed to do it. Then there are some that apply only to states. So, for example, we have currency. We remember during the Articles of Confederation, it was a nightmare because every state made its own currency. A denied power of the state is to coin money. So there can be no Pennsylvania bucks or Pennsylvania whatevers. Only the United States may coin money. So those are denied powers. So as it turns out, the original Constitution stopped here. And if you're in class, this is a lot easier to do. But if I say I was dividing up power between you and I, you're getting some power and I'm getting some power. I'm the nation, you're the state. Just listen to this for a second. Okay, here's what UDEL gets to do specifically. Here's what UDEL is implied you can do. Here's what UDEL can't do. And here's what you can't do. Moving on. And people eventually figure out, like, wait, what can the state do? Right? You're not giving it any power. And the perhaps less than obvious answer is you can't list the powers of the state in the United States Constitution. That would be up for the citizens of each state to decide. So there's some certain logic to that. But as you might imagine, the Anti-Federalists were not happy with that. That was not sufficient enough. And you might also remember the Anti-Federalists required that the amendments be added to the Constitution. So they demanded there be a 10th amendment. Well, they demanded a whole Bill of Rights, but in particular, they really wanted a 10th amendment. And the 10th Amendment's text is here. And again, I would make you do this. On your own, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. So I think you probably can figure that out if you try, but because I'm going a little quicker, if we did not delegate it to the United States, so we didn't give it to the United States, nor did we deny it to the state. So it's not on list A, given to the United States, and it's not on list B, states can't do it, then it is reserved to the states. And the word reserved is important because they're not giving them, they're just saying, hey, they're not ours. It's up to your citizens. If your state has them, you have them. And that is the name of these powers. They are called the reserved powers. And some of the traditional ones, perhaps the most important one, is what's known as the police power. And that is not a power to literally have a police department. It is a general power granted to the government of a state to make laws for the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens. So like a general grant of power to make laws that work for our everyday life. Other things would be education, licensing. I still don't think it's right. God, it's driving me crazy. I'm going to go LIC period because I'm having brain freeze. So a driver's license, a doctor's license, a teacher's license, all of those things. And last but not least, education is often listed. So you may think, and it is true, the federal government is involved with education now, but like at Octorara, probably 90% plus of all the money to run the school comes either from the state of Pennsylvania or locally in the Octorara School District. So that is a reserved power. So that is in general how the powers are set up. Now, the next place that we get to is, well, I'm actually going to jump ahead and I'm going to steal this quote off this page because it becomes relevant. And it says, when it comes to federalism, the Constitution is only a starting point in the debate. And it's pretty important to understand what that means and really how upsetting it might be if you thought about it carefully. The Constitution is supposed to be our playbook describing what it is that the government can and can't do. So when a constitutional scholar, and pretty much every constitutional scholar I know would agree with the statement, says that when you're trying to decide what power belongs to which government, the Constitution is only a starting point in the debate. And this goes back to that same fight that Madison and Hamilton had. You can read different parts of the Constitution and say they take precedence. So in our governmental system, this is a little bit simplified, but in general, we have oscillated between two different views of federalism. One is called this dual federalism, which hopefully you saw in the video, and the other one is a marble cake federalism. Now, the one thing I want to say to you is there are no such thing as federalists and anti-federalists anymore, but since we just finished talking about them, when the Federalists agreed to the Constitution, especially people like Hamilton and Madison, they probably had this in mind, a system where notice that the federal government and the states might work together, and sometimes the federal government gets involved in the state's business, but again, it is the nation that is supreme. And when they say work together, they do mean they work together. But remember from your homework also, you had that thing, the supremacy clause. The anti-federalists, when they finally did agree with the Constitution and they insisted on the 10th Amendment, almost certainly had something closer than this in mind. And their idea was to draw this distinct line. And it may be true that the nation is on top, right? Like its laws are supreme. But when it comes to something like education, there are no federal laws. So we are supreme. Notice that the national government rules by enumerated powers only. So they do not like the elastic clause. They don't like this implied thing. The federal government should stay in its lane. So when you ask them to defend why the Constitution should be this type, they will say the 10th Amendment, the dual federalism. On the other hand, if you ask the Federalists, or again, there are no Federalists today, if you ask somebody today who's defending this more model thing, they're going to point to the elastic laws, which allows the federal government to stretch and make these green powers that are shared. And even though they are shared powers, if the powers conflict, we know the supremacy clause is going to make the nation win. They're also going to point to the supremacy clause. So what's happened through the long history of our country is that we have had argument after argument over federalism things. And many of these have ended up in the Supreme Court. Many of them have been handled in Congress. But two things sort of go on. One is we're arguing over which side should have more power. Do we want more centralized government like this, or do we want more power spread out in the states like this? And secondly, I will tell you this flat out, both liberals and conservatives do the exact same thing. If liberals or conservatives think they can win on an issue, like get what they want from this model of federalism, then they start defending this model of federalism. If liberals and conservatives think they can get what they want from this model of federalism, then they start defending this model of federalism. Now, that's not always true. And I will give you one example from a guy you've never heard of, and I'm forgetting his name too. He ran for president. He was an actor on the original Law and Order, Fred Thompson. He was a senator. And this was in early 2000s. So gay marriage was much more controversial at the time. And he was very conservative. He said, look, I'm against gay marriage, but I live in South Carolina, and that's what we want there. If the people from Vermont want gay marriage, the federal government really has no say. It's none of my business. So notice, even though he was going to lose on the issue, he said, I believe in this kind of federalism. Whereas many other conservatives were saying, we need a constitutional amendment defining marriages between one man and one woman. So all of a sudden they're saying, let's use the national government to stamp out these states that are trying to legalize gay marriage. Now, liberals do the same thing. I don't have an example off the top of my head, so this is not a bash the conservative thing. But the point is there are some people who will just say, well, it's not what I wanted, but it is states' rights, so that's what they get to do in their state. There are other people who will switch models depending on which is most important. So when we get together in class, what we're going to see is we're going to see that we're going to play with this scale right here. And the way this game works is some of these things are on that sheet you have to do for homework. And all of these are different things that have impacted the way federalism works over time in the United States. And we're going to describe what happened, and then you have to drag them to the correct side. Did they increase state power, or did they increase national power? And if you do indeed drag it to the correct side, you will get a reward noise. There's no penalty noise. I wish I could make a penalty noise, but I can only make a reward noise. So I'm going to tell you the first case, which is right here. It's McCullough versus Maryland, just to get you started. And I'm going to ask you to, like, pause the video and guess on your own. Obviously, you don't have to. You can be watching at this double speed, which I'm guessing you probably are, although I talk pretty quickly as it is, so double speed is probably a bad idea. At any rate, McCullough is the guy. Even though George Washington went with the bank, later on, the state of Maryland challenged it and said, in our system of government, when we give half the power to the nation and half the power to the state, what that means is if the nation crosses that line by, like, making a bank, it's up to the state to push back. And Maryland did push back. And this is what they did. They said, we will tax the Bank of the United States if you build it in Maryland. We're just going to tax it, and we'll tax it so high we'll drive it out of existence. And that is our way of checking the nation. That's our taxing power. It's a legitimate power. And so the argument that got all the way to the Supreme Court was two parts. A, is a bank implied by the elastic clause, right? Is that in there or not? That's what we talked about before. And B, can Maryland check the USA with taxing? So even if it is implied, to some degree, can Maryland check the United States of America by saying, no, you've gone too far and we're using our taxing power, which we're allowed to do. So if you want to guess and think about that for a second, you can pause the video. If you don't want to guess and you're just hoping to get this done, then the answer is the Supreme Court came back with a double-barreled victory for the United States of America. So they said, in fact, a bank is implied. The United States is allowed to do that. It's implied by the elastic clause. And no, Maryland may not tax a legitimate power of the United States. So it was a win for the U.S. and a smackdown for state powers. So when we get to class and we're playing this game, if you had figured that out, you would say, did that increase state power? Doesn't sound like it. Maryland got a smackdown. Does it increase U.S. power? Oh, yeah, they're allowed to make a bank. And you drag this over here. And you would be rewarded with that sound. Okay, so that's Mr. Udell signing off. I just want to make sure you understand the other work you have to do. So let me minimize this. Let me get somewhere where you can actually see something, not the screen where I'm still making your assignment. Courses. So you will notice in this week for 2-1, that's really not what I wanted to do. I wanted to go here. There's the description of the work for this week. The assignment itself is the changes in federalism that you have to do. And I don't know if nobody has started it yet, which I completely understand. So I'll just open it. Oh, look at that. I didn't even know I did McCullough versus Maryland. So look at that. I got started for you, the first one. You would do a description of the case just like I did. Now, it's going to be harder for you because you don't know it off the top of your head. Only dorks like me do. And you have to go through and say they wanted to make a bank, Maryland sued them, and eventually the United States won. And then you would predict that this increased cooperative federalism. So you have to do the same thing for Gibbons versus Ogden, the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, 1984, a thing called unfunded mandates, and U.S. versus Lopez, and then you have a free choice. See, it's like being in grade school again. There you go. And the free choice can come from any of these cases here, right? And then you describe the case and say which side was stronger. All right. So I hope that's clear. I am available all day tomorrow for questions if this is in fact a snow day. So I'll be sitting right around here somewhere. I will answer email, and if need be, I can always hop on and do a Google Meet. All right. Hope you're enjoying the snow.